Welcome to Hammer of the North, Viking historical fiction, written by Bjorn Wolfe, narrated by R.K. Marks, copyright 2023 by Audiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit Audiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Chapter 1. How the Vow was Made. The hall of the Danish kings in Lera was overflowing with guests on an autumn evening in the year 994. King Harald Gormson had recently fallen in battle, and his son Harald Twiskjeg, also known as Forkbeard, was celebrating his accession feast in the hall of his ancestors. The city was surrounded by a whole host of tents and brush huts. 60 ships had come from Jomsborg, carrying the noblest members of the famous Viking Brotherhood, under their chiefs Haldor, Sigvald, and Bui the Thick. Visitors and Danes alike were dressed in their finest attire, and the town and camp were alit with joyful festivity. Inside the great hall, ancient weapons and trophies of the hunt were hung on display. The floor was covered with a thick layer of fresh rushes, and the long tables were abundant with food. At one end of the hall, King Harald sat with his chiefs and the Jomsborg nobles, while above them stood the king's throne. Along the hall were placed the Vikings and men of Denmark, with Queen Gunhild and her ladies sitting at the far end. Servants moved quickly through the hall, bearing plates and horns of ale. In the center of the room, between the tables and in front of the king's throne, 2 skalds played their harps and sang of the great deeds of King Harald and his son, the new king. As the hunger of the guests was sated, they began wondering what vow the new king would make. It was customary for the airship feast for the new king to make a vow to do some great and noble deed. Seated near Queen Gunhild were 2 boys who were guests of honor. One of them, fair and ruddy-cheeked, was Sigurd Fairhair. The other, darker with quick, bold eyes, was Vidar Akesson, a nephew of Bui and grandson of Palnatoki, the founder of the Viking Brotherhood. Though Vidar was only 17, he and his cousin Sigurd were already known for their prowess. Sigurd was particularly elated tonight. Before the feast, King Harald had given him a very fine sword, which he was proud of. Glancing over at him with a smile, Queen Gunhild asked, "Sigurd, have you shown Freyja your new sword?" Freyja, the niece of Sigurd, sat beside him, and her eyes shone with mischievous excitement. "Of course he has. He is going to test it on the giant pine tree by the harbor tomorrow," she said. This elicited a chorus of laughter from their companions, with Vidar teasing Sigurd, "Just make sure you don't bring down the tree and sink our best ships." Sigurd blushed, but quickly retorted, "Well, at least I never woke the entire camp because I mistook a pig for a spy." This caused everyone to erupt in laughter, even the queen joining in the joviality. Suddenly King Harald stood up and grabbed a magnificent silver bowl. With a calm demeanor he drank its contents, and then handed it over to an attendant. As he walked to the throne, the hall fell silent in anticipation. "As I ascend my father Harald's throne, I hereby vow with the help of God to lead my fleet to the land of England. Within 3 winters I will drive out King Bjorn Wolfe and sit on his throne," exclaimed the king with unwavering confidence. The hall erupted into a loud cheer, congratulating the king on his grand ambition. Whispering to Sigurd, Freyja commented, "Look how pale the queen has become. I believe the vow has caught her off guard." Indeed, Queen Gunhild had paled. She knew that such a vow meant war, and its outcome was uncertain. Before Sigurd could reply to Freyja, Haldor Sigvald rose from his seat and demanded attention. "Men of Denmark and Jomsborg," he began in his deep voice, "I too shall make a vow, and not a light one at that. As you all know, the heathen Haldor Ragnvald now reigns over Norway, while the rightful king, Tryggvi's son, is either wandering or dead. Thus I vow to go to Norway and wrest the reins of power from Haldor Ragnvald and restore the rightful king's rule within 3 winters. Sigvald took a seat, and the room was silent with amazement until young Vidar Akesson shouted out, "Cheers to Haldor Sigvald!" The crowd erupted into cheers as Sigvald's brother, Thorkel the Tall, stood up and swore to follow Haldor. Bui the Thick joined him. Vidar, from the opposite end of the room, joined in with fresh cheers, declaring, "I'm with you, and before I return I shall slay Thorkel Lera for betraying my father to his death." The excitement continued, with Sigurd eagerly announcing, "I'm with you, Vidar." The queen gazed at Vidar and Sigurd with a saddened expression and said, "You are being reckless, my boys. Do you understand the gravity of these oaths, the blood and tears they will cause?" Sigurd respectfully replied,
Noble Gunhild, we understand, but Halldor Ragnvald is a wicked pagan, and so is Thorkel. Besides, I will no longer need to test my new sword on a tree," he said with a sly grin. The queen remained silent, observing King Harold. Freya whispered to Vidar, "That was splendid. I wish I could come along." Vidar chuckled. "You wouldn't last a second. The first war horn would have you down below, trembling." Freya retorted, "That's not true. I can shoot better than both of you." Sigurd excitedly challenged her to a match the next day, promising to give her his trained falcon from France if she wins. Freya eagerly accepted and exclaimed, "I'm going to win that bird tomorrow morning." She then stood up to follow the queen out, and Sigurd and Vidar left the hall to head to their tent. As they walked, Vidar asked Sigurd, "What do you think of these vows we've made?" Sigurd thoughtfully replied, "Now that we have cooled down, it looks different. It's one thing for King Harold to conquer England with the resources of his realm, but it's another for Sigvald to conquer Norway with just the brother of Jomsborg behind him. But listen, fair hair, we are Christian folk, and Ragnvald is a pagan and a traitor. That will make a difference, certainly. My vow wasn't made in haste. I must avenge my father's death or face shame for eternity." Sigurd nodded, knowing very well that the fierce Vikings would not obey someone who couldn't take revenge for their father's betrayal. As they walked back to their tent, a man ran up, and Vidar recognized him as one of Bui's men in the moonlit night. "Ahoy, Egil! What's the matter?" Vidar asked. "You and Sigurd are summoned to Halldor Sigvald's large tent for an urgent meeting," Egil panted. Without delay, the boys followed him to the big tent where all the leaders of Jomsborg had assembled, and took their places beside Bui of Bornholm, who was speaking as they arrived. "It was a reckless vow, Sigvald, but we can't turn back now, and this could earn us great honor, win or lose. Our Vikings are the greatest warriors in the world today, and we will give Ragnvald and his son Eric a fierce battle," Bui proclaimed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the tent, and Sigvald stood up. "Brothers, I was too impetuous in making the vow, but now it's been made, we can't recant. My suggestion is that since we are going to do this, we should do it without any delay. We should call for reinforcements and go for Norway's capital without delay. What do you think?" Vidar came forward, saying, "I can vouch for my father's ships and men. Let's strike before Ragnvald has a chance to confront us. We have some of the best men and most of our ships with us. We should leave here by the end of the week, wait at Limmerfjord for the rest of our men, and then sail towards Hlidskjalf." "Good for you, Vidar!" exclaimed his uncle. "Some say I'm a little plump, but my comrades never complain of my weight in battle." Everyone laughed, for although Bui was a heavy-set man, he was one of the most skilled warriors of his time. "I'll offer Sigurd to accompany you if you would like," he continued. The boy's heart danced with excitement. This was precisely what he had wished. Halldor Sigvald smiled. "Is it decided, then, that we will head for Limmerfjord from here by the 4th day?" The response was a resounding yes. The sound of clanging weapons echoed through the council chamber as the chiefs celebrated their decision with sword and spear striking against their shields. Despite this display of force, the meeting came to a close. Many leaders lingered to discuss finer points and the urgency of sending word to Jomsborg immediately. The young boys returned to their tent, weary from the day's events. As they drifted into slumber, the distant cries of "Skål! Skål!" reached their ears, a reminder that the boisterous Vikings and Danes still revelled and made pledges, some of which they would undoubtedly regret come morning. Chapter 2. The Shooting Match. Early the next morning, the 3 young Vikings were up and about, the smell of campfire still clinging to their clothes. Ready for the day ahead, they grabbed their bows and quivers and set off for town. Their destination was the King's Hall, where the brave and fearless Freya lived with Queen Gunhild. Despite the early hour, the hall was bustling with activity, as servants scurried about laying fresh rushes and preparing for the day ahead. Sigurd hailed a housecarl, one of the Queen's warriors, and sent him to inquire about Freya's whereabouts. 5 minutes later, Freya emerged from the hall, bow and quiver in hand, a bright smile on her face. "Good morning, my Vikings," she greeted them cheerfully, poking fun at their plans from the day before. "Has your rash resolution cooled off yet?" Vidar grinned in response, his eyes a mixture of amusement and seriousness. "Small chance of that," he replied. Sigurd added jovially, "My falcon is ready to change owners, but I suppose there's no chance of that today." Freya eyed him playfully. "Oh, really? We'll see about that, Lord of Jomsborg and Bornholm." With laughter and chatter, the group set off towards the harbour, leaving the town behind and crossing through the fields. As they reached the top of the hill overlooking the harbour, they paused to admire the magnificent fleet below them. 60 Jomsborg ships, along with the vessels of the Danish lords, were docked below. Each ship was adorned with glistening shield rims, while their dragon prows and elaborately crafted sterns were painted with striking designs. Freya couldn't help but marvel at the impressive display. "Oh, how wonderful it is to be a Viking!" she exclaimed, a hint of wistfulness in her voice. "I wish I were a boy." Sigurd chuckled. "It's not all it's cracked up to be," he said. "There's the drilling and practice in arms every morning, the weapons to be sharpened, and let's not forget the rowing. My back aches just thinking about those heavy oars." Vidar pointed to a particular longship set apart from the rest, with a gilded prow. "There's our ship," he said. "Sigurd may complain, but he's just as skilled as anyone in the fleet with sword and shield, except for his father and Haldor and you, of course," he added, turning to Freya. She grinned back at him. "Let's not forget about my falcon. I'm anxious to decide on its fate." The trio left the road and walked for a couple of miles until they reached a desolate stretch of shoreline, rocky and wild. Vidar set up an old wooden shield as a target on a rock 100 feet away, and the three began to take turns practicing their archery skills. "Shoot first," commanded Freya. "I'll go next, then Vidar." Sigurd nodded and selected an arrow. He strung his bow, laid the shaft, and pulled the string to his ear. Twang! The arrow buried itself deep in the shield, just above the center iron boss. "Good enough!" cried Vidar, running forward. But Freya only smiled and raised her bow. The string twanged, and an echoing answer came as the arrow glanced off, causing the shield to fall backward. "Hurrah!" cried Vidar, picking up the shield. "Full on the iron boss, but you can't do it again." Sigurd also ran forward, but a sudden cry startled them. They turned to see Freya struggling with 3 men, while more were coming from behind the cliff. "Norsemen and spies!" exclaimed Sigurd. Without hesitation, he picked up Freya's arrow and ran forward, fitting it to his bow. "Your sword!" called Vidar, tearing the peace bands from his weapon as he ran. A shout answered him, and the Norseman ran forward to meet Sigurd. A spear whizzed by his head, and he loosed the bow. The foremost Viking fell with a clash, and as the others paused, Sigurd tore the peace bands from his sword. Next he was surrounded, struggling and striking, as he realized that more men had appeared from behind the cliff. Now a blade gleamed beside him, and Vidar's voice sounded in his ear. 1 man was down, 2, but others filled their places, and a heavy axe was poised over Sigurd. As it fell, the boy darted in beneath the blow, and his sword fell on the Viking's shoulder. At that moment, something crashed onto his light steel cap, and he knew no more. Sigurd awoke with a dull pain in his head, with his arms tightly bound, and the midday sun beating down on him. As Sigurd raised his head, he saw that he lay on the forecastle of a small ship. Vidar was wounded in the shoulder beside him, unconscious. He saw nothing of Freya, and a burning thirst consumed him. With great effort he rose to a sitting position and looked around. They were out at sea, and the land lay far behind them. In the stern and waist of the ship were 15 or 20 Norsemen. The sound of a voice interrupted Sigurd's thoughts as he twisted around to see a dark man with an unpleasant face standing behind him. The man seemed to be the leader, for he had just come out of a cabin. "That was a stiff crack I gave you, lad, but the steel cap saved your skull," the man said. Sigurd tried to speak, but his tongue was dry, and the man laughed. "Here, Thord," he called, "bring a horn of water." One of the men in the waist took a horn and filled it from the cask beside the mast, handing it up to the leader, who put it to Sigurd's lips. Sigurd drank greedily, and then the other threw a few drops over Vidar, who opened his eyes. He struggled to rise with a sharp cry. "Thorkell I—" The effort was too much for him, and he fell back again. Their captor smiled sneeringly. "He is in a bad way to fulfill his vow, eh? This was the man whom Vidar had sworn to kill, the betrayer of his father." As Sigurd realized this, his head cleared. "Why did you attack us? Who are you?" he asked indignantly. Thorkell laughed again. "Vidar, there, seemed to know my face. You two and the girl, whom I take to be Gunhild's niece, will make a nice gift to Haldor Ragnvald. Great boasts, great boasts." Sigurd flushed. As he looked at the Viking, his heart gave a sudden leap. Framed in the cabin doorway behind, he saw the face of Freyja, her finger on her lips. Making no sign, Sigurd answered the leader calmly. "In that case, leave us alone till we get to Hlidskjalf." As he said this, Sigurd lay down again, turning his back on Thorkell. The latter sneered and stepped to the edge of the forecastle, above the ship's waist. Sigurd opened his eyes and saw Freya making signs and holding his sword in her hand. Sigurd understood the plan instantly. He silently drew his feet up and gathered his muscles. Thorkel was giving orders a few steps away and paid no heed to him. The boy slowly rose to one knee. He saw Freya run towards him. At the same instant, he threw himself headfirst at Thorkel, striking him fairly in the waist. The Viking fell forward with a cry and lay lifeless on the deck. Sigurd was about to follow him over the low rail, but a hand held him back. His arms were bound, but the tight knots were quickly cut, and a sword thrust into his hand.
"Hold the ladder," the girl panted. "I'll wake Vidar."
Sigurd climbed to the top of the ladder just in time to see the surprised men grabbing their weapons. Arrows whizzed past his head, one after the other, but he parried them confidently with his sword. Freya ran to the cabin, returning swiftly with a shield. "Here," she said, handing it to Sigurd. The shield protected him from the spear that the first man tried to get him with, but then the man began to climb up the ladder, holding a shield above his head. Sigurd swung his sword with all his might, and it sliced through the shield and the man's body, causing him to fall back among his comrades. Thord, who had brought water to the ship, now rushed up the ladder with an axe. Sigurd was too late to drive his sword, and the axe crashed into his shield, making him fall to his knees. The axe raised again, but Thord fell back with a loud scream, hitting the men below him. Sigurd jumped up, seeing the frightened faces of the men below. He noticed Freya behind him, bow in hand, and Vidar next to him, looking pale but resolute. "We can't keep this up all day," Sigurd shouted to Vidar. "They'll finish us off with arrows sooner or later." Vidar pointed to the cabin. "We can hold them off in there. Freya says there's food and water inside." Sigurd laughed. "You look like a Valkyrie, Freya. I owe you my life. But what's Thorkel doing?" "Back to the cabin," Freya cried in alarm. "They're climbing around the bow to attack us from behind." They saw a group of men scaling the side of the ship, making their way towards the bow beneath the dragon's head. With no hope of fending off the entire foredeck, the two boys and Freya ran for the cabin, locking the door and fortifying it with a sturdy bolt. The tiny room was void of natural light, save for one or two slits positioned high above, just enough to let some air in. "What hope do we have of being rescued?" asked Freya, collapsing onto a stack of furs. "Not much," muttered Vidar, as Sigurd plopped down beside her. "No one knows where we've gone, and we won't be noticed missing until noon, if we're lucky." The Norsemen, realizing that breaking in was as futile as resistance, made no further attempts. The hours dragged on as the three captives came to the grim realization that they would soon be at the mercy of their captors. The vessel was continuing its course northward, propelled by the full force of unfurled sails. It dawned on them that the Norsemen must have spied on the Danes, identifying them as lucrative potential hostages. Vidar, having been roughed up in the process, and the three of them taken captive as soon as they boarded the ship. Freya, left unguarded, had seized the moment Sigurd regained consciousness and made their way to the cabin. Late in the evening, they heard a familiar voice from beyond the door. "Vidar Akison, can you hear me?" called Thorkel. Chapter 3. Halldor Ragnvald of Norway. Vidar looked at Freya and then back at Halldor Ragnvald. He knew that they couldn't hold out forever, but surrendering to a traitor was out of the question. "We wish to speak with you, Halldor Ragnvald, before making any decisions," Vidar said firmly. Halldor Ragnvald's eyes narrowed, but he agreed to meet with them later that day. As they waited, the three captives tended to their wounds but refused to bind them up, as it was against the Jomsvikings' strict laws. Pain was just a part of their training, and they endured it without complaint. When Halldor Ragnvald arrived, they could hear his voice outside the ship. Freya recognized it immediately, and they prepared themselves. Without hesitation, Sigurd opened the door to reveal the imposing figure of Halldor Ragnvald. His beard and hair were as sunny as Sigurd's, but his face was grim and his eyes were shifty. "Will you surrender to me?" Halldor Ragnvald asked calmly. Vidar and Freya exchanged looks, and Vidar spoke up. "We will surrender, but only if you promise not to bind us." Halldor Ragnvald nodded, and they emerged from the ship, battered and exhausted, but still defiant. As they walked away with their captors, they knew that they had upheld the honor of the Jomsvikings. Freya let out a hearty laugh. "So you're fighting against girls now, Halldor? Well, I'll surrender then." Halldor smiled and affectionately stroked her hair. "Keep the bow, my child. You have done nobly and well. Come to my ship." As they descended the ladder and boarded his ship, Sigurd noticed Ragnvald's greying hair and stiff gait, likely from old wounds. Beside Thorkel's ship, an impressive warship awaited them. As they boarded, the two ships separated. Ragnvald led them to his cabin and spoke kindly. "Sit and don't be afraid. Thorkel has told me of your tale, especially your vow, Vidar Akesson. Your comrades will have a difficult time trying to take Norway from me. By Thor's hammer, they'll need it." He smiled, but it was a reticent grimace. "Freya," Sigurd interjected, "did Haldor order the attack on us? You know he is my uncle." Ragnvald nodded. "I regret that you were taken, but you will later be returned unharmed, with whatever scat Harold decides is fair." "But who are you, fair hair?" Sigurd grinned. "That is what they call me, Haldor. My name is Sigurd Buisson." Ragnvald whistled in surprise. "Ah, then I have two good hostages. Even better. I'll take you to Hlidskjalf with me, but don't worry, you'll be treated kindly for now." With that, Ragnvald exited the cabin, leaving the boys to themselves. Throughout the voyage the boys were treated well and their weapons were returned to them. Under other circumstances, they would have enjoyed themselves immensely. That night they arrived at the southern end of Norway, and Ragnvald pushed the ship to its limits, eager to reach his kingdom's capital, Hlidskjalf. The next day they landed at Hous. Ragnvald then sent messengers north over the mountains to his son Haldor Eirik in Raumarika. He also dispatched split war arrows to nearby chiefs as a call to arms. With fresh rowers, the ship hastened to Hlidskjalf. The very fate of Norway was on the line. That evening they arrived in Raumsdale to rest and replenish their crew with new rowers. But they wasted no time and continued their journey at a fast pace, reaching the city just after the sun had set on the third day. The news of their arrival had spread like wildfire, and as they made landfall, a clamorous throng welcomed them with great fanfare. Haldor Ragnvald, the leader of the group, kept the boys by his side and instructed Freyja to make her way to the king's hall, where she would receive the attention and care befitting her station. He then led the crowd to the imposing temple of Thor, the god of war, without paying a visit to the king's hall himself. Haldor Ragnvald, like the majority of his subjects, held steadfast beliefs in the pagan deities of Norway. He was the high priest and held the Hlidskjalf temple, the most prominent in the region, in high regard. As they crossed the threshold of the temple entrance, Sigurd Fairhair shuddered, and Vidar whispered to him, "Stay strong, Sigurd, stay strong." Sigurd squeezed his friend's hand in response. Being Christians, the boys had resolved not to join in the worship of the heathen gods. The temple was dimly lit by flickering torches. At the sides of the walls, statues of the one-eyed Odin and the enchanting Freya adorned the space. The altar at the end of the room faced the golden sculpture of Thor, and Haldor Ragnvald ascended the steps slowly. As he did so, the gathered Vikings, bonders, and townsfolk prostrated themselves. Sigurd observed the priests bring in a white bull for sacrifice beyond the altar. When he looked around, he noticed that he and Vidar were the only ones standing. Then others saw them, and an angry grumble murmured reminiscent of an impending storm. The two boys grew pale at the hostile noise, but they remained firm and upright as Haldor Ragnvald prayed to the god of war. Once he finished, the enraged mutter behind him transformed into a tremendous roar, with people screaming, "Kneel! Kneel! Death to the Christians!" Ragnvald turned around and raised his hand, silencing the crowd instantly. When he realized the cause of the ruckus, his expression grew somber. "To your knees! To your knees! You dare insult Thor in his own domain?" he barked. "We kneel before none but Jesus Christ." Sigurd proudly voiced his dissent, though his heart was beating rapidly. Ragnvald's hand shot to his sword, and the crowd advanced, menacing in its fury. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, Ragnvald's hand dropped and he signaled to one of his men. "Harold, take these two to the king's hall and make sure that no harm comes to them, or your life will be forfeited. Go." Without a word, the two boys followed Harold through the Norsemen, their heads held high and their hands tightly gripping their swords. The air was thick with muttered threats, but eventually they emerged into the dark streets, where their guide led them directly to the hall. Once inside, their door was bolted shut, and at the sound of the lock, Vidar broke the silence. "Whew, that was a close one, old man. I was scared stiff when you answered Ragnvald." "Me too," Sigurd admitted with a smile, "but we're too valuable as hostages. We didn't need much bravery at all. The question is, are we going to stay with Ragnvald?" "Not if we can help it," Vidar laughed. "But we'll have to be cautious. We'll be watched closely, and we'll need to watch out for Freya." Sigurd nodded in agreement. "True, we'll see her in the morning. For now, she's not in danger." In reality, it was a full week before they saw Freya again. For 6 long days they remained confined to their room, with no sign of what the future would bring. Their warder was the same man who had led them from the temple on the first night, and on the 6th morning he finally came with an unexpected announcement. "You're free to leave the town, but don't go too far. Haldor Ragnvald has left, so be watchful. I'm responsible for you."
"Where has Ragnvald gone? Is Lady Freyja here?"
Vidar asked.
"I know nothing about Lady Freyja, but Haldor Ragnvald has gone south to Mora to return with forces to meet Haldor Erik." Without waiting for more information, the 2 boys rushed out of the room and headed towards the great hall. Eventually they found a woman who directed them to Freyja's room. Upon seeing the boys, Freyja let out a cry of joy. "Oh, I thought you were dead. I saw Haldor Ragnvald once, but he was terribly busy and would tell me nothing. Where have you been?"
Vidar recounted their daring escapade at the temple and their subsequent imprisonment in a few words, leaving Freyja gasping in disbelief.
"I would never have dared to face all those men like that," she exclaimed. "Come over here by the window and speak softly. There are women in the next room."
After ensuring the door was securely shut, Sigurd and Vidar joined Freyja at the window.
"Last night I overheard 2 men conversing in the hallway, and I eavesdropped,"
Freyja began. "Haldor Erik has amassed a mighty army of men from Raumadale, Halagaland, and Hlidskjalf, and is frantically preparing a colossal fleet. Meanwhile, Ragnvald is recruiting men from North and South Moor. 2 nights ago, just before Ragnvald left, a messenger arrived from Erik carrying their plan. Once Ragnvald has raised as many men as possible, he will journey north to meet Erik, who is making his way south. Combining their forces will yield a force of at least 150 longboats, and they plan to ensnare your fleet in Hilderun Bay."
"A trap!"
Sigurd exclaimed in disbelief.
"With that immense force?"
"Yes," Freyja confirmed. "However, they fear Jomsborg's warriors, even with the odds in their favour. As such, the peasants will inform Haldor Sigvald that Ragnvald is in Hilderun Bay with only 1 or 2 ships, and Sigvald and Bui will hasten there to capture him, unknowingly placing themselves among the entire fleet. Do you perceive their strategy?"
Sigurd's eyes blazed. "Ragnvald remains a traitor. This is catastrophic, Vidar. No one can evade such a trap."
"I'm afraid you are correct, fair hair," Vidar replied gloomily. "Sigvald will fall into it since he is impetuous and rash, much like your father. There is only one course of action." "What is that?" the others asked in unison. "You, Sigurd, and I need to purloin a boat from the harbour and set sail south. Our chances of reaching Sigvald in time are slim, but we must try. Has Erik arrived at Hlidskjalf?" Vidar turned to Freyja. "Not yet, but he is expected," she replied. "We might make it," Sigurd exclaimed excitedly. At that, Freyja stood tall, her voice resolute. "Wait a minute. If you go, I go too. Don't assume you can leave me behind."